Today we will explore one of the most fascinating and least known chapters in the history of European food, the role of fish in the daily life of the Middle Ages, an era in which faith, medicine, and commerce intertwined around a food that shaped entire civilizations. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. More than 1,000 years ago, on the icy coasts of Norway, in the surging rivers of Central Europe, and in the dark waters of the Baltic Sea, a silent and humble food governed the lives of millions. It was not wheat, nor the meat of great herds. It was fish. For the medieval man and woman, it represented much more than simple sustenance. It was penance, it was medicine, it was a currency of exchange, it was a symbol of devotion. And to understand the place it occupied in that society is to understand something profound about how medieval Europe functioned. The story begins, like so many medieval stories, within the walls of a church. The Catholic Church exercised extraordinary influence over daily life in medieval Europe. Its liturgical calendar dictated, with impressive rigor, what people could and could not eat. Wednesdays were days of fasting in memory of Judas's betrayal. Fridays remembered Christ's suffering on the cross. Saturdays were dedicated to the Virgin Mary. To this were added the 40 days of Lent, the weeks of Advent before Christmas, the eves of major religious feasts, and the so-called Ember Days. When all these days were added up, one reached a surprising conclusion. Approximately 1/3 of the year consisted of days on which meat was forbidden. During these periods, the consumption of meat from warm-blooded animals was prohibited, as were eggs, milk, butter, and cheese. For an entire society, this represented a logistical, economic, and culinary challenge of enormous proportions, and the most widespread solution was fish. But there was a fundamental issue. Fresh fish was a luxury item. Without refrigeration or means of rapid transport, a fish taken from the sea began to deteriorate in a matter of hours. For coastal populations, this did not represent a serious problem. But for the millions of Europeans living in the interior of the continent, fresh fish was rare and expensive. In inland regions, it could cost up to 16 times more than meat. While nobles feasted on fresh fish on fast days, the poorest often went hungry or settled for very modest meals. It was in the face of this necessity that medieval humanity perfected preservation techniques that would transform European trade. The drying, salting, and smoking of fish had been known since antiquity, but it was during the Middle Ages that they reached an unprecedented industrial scale, driven by enormous religious demand. And two fish dominated this trade: herring and cod. Herring was, for centuries, the most important fish in the economy of Northern Europe, caught in immense quantities in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. It was processed in different ways to ensure its preservation and transport over long distances. There was red herring, which underwent a particularly intense curing process. The fish was first eviscerated, then dipped in brine, hung to dry, and then heavily smoked. This prolonged smoking process caused the fish's meat to change color, acquiring a reddish tone that gave it its name. There was also white herring, cured in a more delicate manner, which preserved its original silvery appearance and, according to historical records, kept in good condition for longer than the red variety. Both were packed in barrels and sent throughout Europe, feeding entire populations during long periods of fasting. The economic importance of herring was so great that it became one of the most traded commodities by the Hanseatic League, that powerful confederation of merchant cities in northern Germany that dominated trade between the 12th and 17th centuries. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen built a large part of their wealth on this trade. And the cultural influence of herring was equally profound. In Norwich, England in 1444, an allegorical effigy of Lent was carried dressed in red and white herring skins, symbolizing the long months of abstinence. In 16th century Bavaria, people took to the streets on Ash Wednesday carrying herrings on poles, proclaiming that the feast days were over. Herring was so omnipresent in the Lenten diet that it even generated resentment among those who grew tired of its dry and salty taste. But if herring dominated trade in the early Middle Ages, it was cod that gradually took on the leading role in the European diet. And to understand this transition, one must look north, far beyond the already established trade routes. toward the icy waters surrounding Iceland and the Lofoten Islands in the far north of Norway. North Atlantic cod was an abundant fish with firm meat, qualities that made it ideal for preservation. When cured with salt, it maintained a flavor superior to that of herring and lasted even longer. But there was an even more remarkable form of preservation: stockfish or dried fish. In this method, the cod was cleaned, eviscerated, and hung on large wooden structures in the open air, where the icy, dry Arctic wind did all the dehydration work. Without the need for salt, without the need for smoke, just the cold and constant air transformed the fresh fish into a rigid board of concentrated protein that could be stored for up to a year or more without deteriorating. The result was extraordinary from a logistical point of view, but it presented a considerable culinary challenge. Stockfish, once completely dry, became as hard as a wooden board. Being hit by a piece of dry stockfish was comparable to being struck by a piece of wood. To make it edible again, a laborious and time-consuming process was necessary. First, the fish was beaten for hours with a wooden mallet or hammer to break its hardened fibers. Then it was soaked in water for several days, sometimes up to a week, to slowly rehydrate it. Only after this long preparation could the stockfish be cooked in sauces, baked in ovens, or turned into paste. It was a process that required patience and planning, but the final result was a nutritious and versatile food that sustained entire populations during the most difficult months of the year. The stockfish trade transformed the economy of medieval Norway. At the height of this trade, dried fish represented more than 80% of Norwegian exports. Bergen on the west coast of Norway became the epicenter of this industry, where the Hanseatic League established one of its most important trading posts. More than 2,000 German merchants resided in Bergen, buying stockfish from Norwegian fishermen and exporting it throughout Europe. In exchange, they brought grain, salt from Lüneburg, beer and woolen fabrics. The Bryggen district, with its characteristic wooden warehouses, was built to serve this trade. Even after devastating fires, the structures were rebuilt on the same medieval foundations. Today, Bryggen is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to the economic power that a simple dried fish exerted over European history. But the influence of cod went beyond established trade routes. The Vikings used stockfish as travel rations on their long ocean crossings, and the route they followed at the end of the first millennium, from Norway to Greenland and from Greenland to Newfoundland, corresponds to the natural distribution of Atlantic cod. It is possible that English fishermen also sailed to the western Atlantic as early as 1480 in search of new fishing grounds to feed the demand of European Christians. Fish, therefore, did not only feed bodies, it moved ships and possibly contributed to the discovery of new continents. While herring and cod dominated long-distance trade, a wide variety of other fish populated medieval tables, each with its own characteristics, its methods of preparation, and its position in the social hierarchy of food. To understand how medieval Europeans chose, prepared, and consumed these fish, it is necessary to dive into a system of thought that may seem strange to modern eyes, but which governed European medicine and dietetics for more than 2,000 years. The theory of the four humours. This theory, whose roots go back to Hippocrates and Galen in ancient Greece, postulated that the human body was governed by four fundamental fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each humour possessed elemental qualities. Blood was hot and moist, yellow bile hot and dry, black bile cold and dry, and phlegm cold and moist. Health depended on a harmonious balance between these fluids, and the primary tool for maintaining this balance was diet. Each food was classified according to its humoral qualities, and fish, all of them without exception, were classified as cold and moist, that is, phlegmatic. This meant that the consumption of fish tended to increase phlegm in the body, making the person slower and more lethargic. Doctors warned that fish were difficult to digest and that they generated humours harmful to health. This classification created an interesting paradox. The church required the consumption of fish for 1/3 of the year, but doctors warned that this food could be harmful to health. The solution was ingenious. They recommended that fish be prepared in ways that counterbalanced its cold and moist qualities. Boiling fish in wine was a frequent recommendation, as wine was considered hot and dry. Seasoning with spices like ginger and cinnamon served the same purpose. Cooking with vinegar was another technique, as it was believed to make the fish less harmful. Medieval doctors also established strict hierarchies among different types of fish. Not all fish were considered equal in terms of health and quality. The best, according to these practitioners, were those coming from clear and rocky waters, from lively and well-oxygenated currents. They had to be scaly, of medium size, neither too lean nor too fat, and they should not have an unpleasant smell or an excessively strong taste. This classification had direct consequences on which fish were most valued at the tables of the nobility and which were relegated to the lower classes. Perch, for example, was a fish highly esteemed by medieval doctors. A predator native to the lakes and rivers of Europe and Asia, the perch inhabited clean and rocky waters, which placed it at the top of the humoral hierarchy of fish. It featured prominently in dishes prepared for fast days, combined with vinegar, crushed and mixed with almond milk, or served as a topping in pasta preparations. For the doctors of the time, it was one of the safest and healthiest fish one could consume. The pike occupied an even higher position in the esteem of the nobility. It was considered one of the healthiest fish of all. A voracious predator of European rivers, the pike was frequently stuffed, wrapped in pastry, served in aspic, or crafted as a subtlety at festive banquets. In Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, one of the pilgrims, the Franklin, kept bream and pike in his own fish pond, a symbol of wealth and refinement. The bream, in turn, occupied a different position. Found throughout Central and Northern Europe, it preferred still and muddy waters, which made it ideal for breeding in medieval ponds. But precisely because it inhabited stagnant waters, it was disdained by doctors. Despite this, its ease of breeding made it widely available on fast days. Carp was also raised in ponds and was a popular food among both Christians and Jews, often served on festive occasions. In England, however, it only appeared at the end of the 15th century. Doctors recommended that it be cooked in wine until all the liquid evaporated or baked in a pastry crust. Salmon was so abundant in medieval European rivers that it even generated complaints. There are records of craft apprentices complaining about having to eat salmon more than 3 times a week, a situation that, by modern standards, would seem like a luxury, but for those workers represented an unbearable monotony. Salmon caught in the Rhine and other large European rivers that was not sold fresh was generally dried, salted or smoked, and then sent through the Hanseatic cities of Hamburg, Lübeck and Bremen to all parts of Germany and beyond. One of the oldest surviving culinary records, dating from the end of the 15th century, describes a recipe for roasted salmon in sauce. The fish was cut into round pieces, roasted on a grill and then served with a sauce made of wine powdered, cinnamon, minced onion, vinegar and ginger. It was a preparation that combined flavor with the principles of humoral medicine, using hot and dry ingredients to balance the cold and moist nature of the fish. The sturgeon was another fish of great importance at medieval tables. Caught in the Danube and other large European rivers, including the giant species that produced beluga caviar, the sturgeon was consumed in various regions of the continent. It was a fish associated with nobility and power, often reserved for the wealthiest tables and for great occasions. Tuna was also widely available in medieval Europe, being abundant in both the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. It was a popular food that could be consumed both cooked and raw, a versatility that distinguished it from many other fish of the time. Trout was caught in the wild, but was also raised in medieval fish ponds, sometimes serving as an alternative to other more common fish like salmon. Medieval doctors recommended that trout be boiled in wine until all the liquid evaporated, or baked inside a pastry crust, following the same preparation principles applied to other cold water fish. But medieval Europeans did not limit themselves to consuming conventional fish during fast days. The prohibition of meat from warm-blooded animals led to creative and sometimes quite dubious interpretations of what could or could not be considered fish. Medieval logic was simple. If an animal lived in the water or spent a large part of its time in it, it could be classified as a fish and therefore was permitted during the fast. Dolphins and porpoises, although clearly mammals, were accepted as marine animals and could be consumed. The very word porpoise derives from the Latin porcus piscis, which means pigfish, and in medieval German, the dolphin was called Meerswin, or sea pig. Beaver tails, which were scaly and supposedly tasted like fish, were also considered acceptable. The Benedictine Abbey of Le Tréport in northern France faced censure from the local archbishop when it was discovered that its monks regularly consumed puffins during the fast, arguing that since these birds lived largely in and around the water, they should be considered fish. The most extraordinary case was that of the barnacle goose, an Arctic migratory bird whose habits led some medieval observers to conclude that it was born from barnacles clinging to driftwood at sea. Sir John Mandeville, in the 14th century, claimed that these barnacles came from trees that bore fruit that turned into birds. This classification allowed the bird to be consumed during the fast, although not everyone accepted it. Emperor Frederick II personally examined barnacles and found no evidence of bird embryos. While some sought ways to circumvent the restrictions, others found in the fast an opportunity for culinary creativity. Deprived of eggs and dairy, medieval cooks found ingenious substitutes that anticipated modern vegan alternatives by centuries. Almond milk replaced cow's milk, and almond-based cheeses appeared in medieval cookbooks. Pike roe was combined with strips of salmon to create imitation bacon. Fake eggs were manufactured with inventive mixtures, although with results that left much to be desired in terms of flavor. The variety of culinary preparations was remarkably broad. Fish were roasted, fried, boiled, smoked, preserved in aspic, wrapped in pie crusts, ground into pastes, and combined with elaborate sauces based on imported spices. Bernard of Clairvaux, the influential Cistercian monk of the 12th century, wrote with disapproval about the elaboration of fish dishes served in monasteries. He observed that it was enough to taste the second dish to imagine that one had never tasted fish before. Such was the quality of the preparations. He was especially critical of the sauces and seasonings, feeling they were too seductive for men dedicated to the spiritual life. Not everyone, however, found consolation in fish during Lent. A 15th century English poem titled Farewell Advent, written by James Ryman, a Franciscan friar from Canterbury, expresses the complaints of those who suffered from the dietary restrictions imposed by the Church. In the poem, the narrator laments that he and his kind went to bed hungry for lack of meat. For those who lived far from the coast and did not have access to fresh fish, the periods of fasting could mean an especially lean and painful diet. And there were those who, exasperated by the forced diet of fish, resorted to the consolation of alcohol. The Benedictine monk Robert Ripon, who lived at the turn of the 15th century, recorded with evident disapproval that during Lent, when church law and custom determined that men should fast, very few people abstained from excessive drinking. On the contrary, they went to taverns and some drank and got drunk more than outside of Lent, thinking and saying, "Fish need to swim." It was a pun. That justified drunkenness with humorous logic. If fish swam in water, one might as well swim in beer or wine while eating fish. Fish preservation was an absolute necessity in an era without refrigeration. In addition to drying and salting, preservation in vinegar was widely used, extending the shelf life of the fish and making it, according to doctors, less harmful to health. Smoking imparted distinct flavors that varied according to the type of wood and the duration of the process. The breeding of fish in artificial ponds was a widespread practice, especially in monasteries and noble estates. These ponds guaranteed a constant supply of fresh fish, even far from the sea, with species like bream, carp, trout, and pike. Monasteries invested significantly in fish farming, as their residents were subject to even stricter fasting rules. The role of fish in the medieval economy was immense. The Hanseatic League had one of its fundamental pillars in the fish trade. Herring and stockfish were transported in ships called cogs, along dangerous routes that connected the northern fishing grounds to the southern markets. King's Lynn in England housed the only Hanseatic warehouse on that side of the North Sea, and the dried fish that arrived there were distributed through canals and rivers to the heart of the country. It was a commercial system on a continental scale, and fish was its fuel. This commercial network had consequences that went far beyond the economy. When Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church and created the Church of England in the 16th century, fasting days were initially abandoned. The change had a devastating effect on the British fishing industry. Fishermen lost a huge portion of their clientele overnight. The situation was so serious that Henry's son, Edward VI, upon taking the throne, in 1547, reinstated the days of abstinence from meat by law, not for religious reasons, but for explicit economic reasons, as he himself declared, for the benefit of the Commonwealth, where many are fishermen and live by that craft. It was an official recognition that fish was not just a penitential food. It was the basis of an industry vital for the economic survival of entire communities. The relationship between fish and the Christian faith was much older than medieval fasting rules. The Greek word for fish, ichthys, formed an acrostic for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. This symbol was widely used by early Christian communities as a secret sign of recognition in times of persecution. Most of the apostles were fishermen, called by Jesus to be fishers of men. St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, explicitly distinguished the flesh of fish from that of land animals. There were perhaps practical reasons behind this association. Lenten fasting periods coincided with spring, when the body benefited from the nutrients in fish, rich in B-complex vitamins and folate. The tradition of fasting in spring predated Christianity itself, going back to pagan practices of seasonal renewal. Around the year 1000, there was a significant shift in consumption patterns. Until then, most of the fish consumed was caught locally, in rivers and lakes. From that time on, possibly in response to overfishing, consumption began to concentrate on fish of marine origin, especially dried cod from Scandinavia. This transition drove the development of navigation techniques and the expansion of maritime trade routes. The medieval fishing industry was sophisticated. The use of hooks, harpoons, nets, traps, and aquaculture was widespread throughout Europe. In England, more than 130 churches possess wall paintings with fishing themes, a visual testimony to the importance of this food in the life of communities. What makes this entire story so extraordinary is realizing how a single food could be at the center of so many dimensions of medieval life. Fish was religion, an instrument of penance and spiritual discipline that the church imposed on all the faithful. It was medicine, a food classified and regulated by the theory of the four humours, whose consumption was guided by medieval doctors and nutritionists according to principles dating back to ancient Greece. It was economy, the basis of a continental trade that enriched cities, financed naval fleets, and sustained the powerful Hanseatic League. It was culinary science, an ingredient transformed by creative cooks into sophisticated preparations that rivaled the best meat dishes. It was even politics. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, the collapse of fish consumption threatened an entire industry, forcing his successor to restore the days of abstinence for purely economic reasons. The dried fish that traveled from Lofoten to Bergen, from Bergen to Lübeck, from Lübeck to the tables of European families, carried with it much more than proteins and calories. It carried centuries of religious tradition, medical knowledge, culinary innovation, and commercial entrepreneurship. It was, in its own way, an invisible thread that connected the Norwegian fisherman to the Benedictine monk, the Galenic doctor to the court cook, the Hanseatic merchant to the English housewife. And when we look back at this distant past, it is impossible not to be impressed by the ingenuity and resilience of those men and women who, without refrigeration, without motorized transport, without any of the conveniences we today consider indispensable, managed to build a food and commercial system on a continental scale, all around a food that, paradoxically, was at the same time despised by doctors, imposed by the church, and desired by merchants. The rivers that were once so full of salmon that apprentices complained of eating it too often, the seas that provided herring in quantities that seemed inexhaustible, the Arctic winds that transformed fresh cod into boards of imperishable protein. All of this is part of a story that deserves to be remembered and told. Because in this story, There are not just fish and nets. There is faith and commerce, science and superstition, wealth and hunger, creativity and resignation. There is, in short, the human condition itself, reflected in the waters of a past, that, though distant, continues to speak to us. If this journey through the waters and tables of medieval Europe has piqued your curiosity, if you wish to continue exploring the forgotten chapters of history that shaped the world we live in, then subscribe to this channel. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of this story most caught your attention and which medieval theme you would like to see explored in a future documentary. And if this video was valuable to you, share it with someone who also appreciates diving into the depths of the past, because history, like the Zeus, still has much to reveal to us.